Hi, I'm Dan, and welcome to Polar Currency and video number 45, USA versus Canada versus Mexico, the Currency Smackdown 1980s edition. This is the sixth video comparing the currency that the US, Canada, and Mexico has issued over the past 100 years. See the description below for the other 5 videos. In 2020, I started collecting world banknotes and noticed that when it came to Mexico, Canada, and the US, that all 3 countries changed their currency at roughly the same time. So I've broken down the last century into what I call decade segments. The timeline doesn't align exactly, but it's close, and there are some overlaps. I'll highlight the overall design, color, who or what is depicted, security features, and of course, a few background stories. The 1980s saw one country roll out a brand new design, one continue a new design by updating or adding a total of 8 denominations, and one did nothing. Not even improved security measurements. All 3 currencies were roughly about the same size dimensionally. Well, enough talk, let's get to the smackdown. As always, we'll start with Canada, then Mexico, and last but not least, the United States.
The Bank of Canada began planning for a new series of notes in 1980. Technology was catching up by the early 80s, and color copiers were a large threat. Never been used security features were implemented along with an identification feature for the visually impaired. To hinder counterfeiting, it was decided to use a single large focal point on both sides, which was considered more secure than previous complex designs of the past. A quick, fast fact is that some specific banknotes issued by the Bank of Canada, going back to the issue of 1935, have been demonetized. The most common discontinued notes are the 1s and 2s. These notes no longer have legal tender status, meaning they can't be used in commerce. Other denominations, including the $25, $500, and $1,000 denominations. You can still take them to a bank and exchange them for new banknotes, which would probably be a mistake because most likely they have a higher collector value.
Canadian 1980s designs featured oversized images and numbers for easy legibility. This was the last series to carry traditional-looking gouache or lathe-work patterns as seen in the numbers and bands on the front of the notes. The Bank of Canada decided to feature birds on the reverse of the notes because of their political neutrality and for their visual simplicity. Nature artist John Crosby was hired to provide the bird illustrations. Each bird species was chosen both for its pan-Canadian habitat and to complement the color and themes of the notes. And the nickname continues because it's the Birds of Canada series. This would be the first issue without a $1 bill and the last series for the 2 and the 1,000. These bills were issued in the mid to late 1980s and circulated well into the early 2000s.
No more $1 bill for Canada, so that means we start with the Red Brown 2. To save time, I'm only going to go over the main design features of the 1986 2, as all are similar for the denominations. The main feature is the portrait. It's about 30% larger than the previous issue. I will say I'm not a fan of the portrait or its likeness to the 1983 photo of Queen Elizabeth II. I just don't think it captures her likeness. The large denomination numeral dominates the left side of the note, followed by the center Bank of Canada block. Above that is the Canadian coat of arms, and to the far right of the portrait is a vignette of various buildings of Canada's Parliament Hill in Ottawa. Each denomination has a different illustration. The lathe work is also different for each denomination. The 2 was withdrawn from circulation on February 16, 1996. 3 days later, on February 19th, the new $2 coin, affectionately called the toonie, was put into circulation. For me, this is kind of sad because $2 notes always hold something special for me and always create conversation. The main vignette on the reverse 2 features the very well-known indigenous bird to most of North America, the robin, which for most folks in the North know seeing robins return is one of the first signs of spring. Canada is spelled out with very large text, creating a negative space background. The Birds of Canada issue was the first to include a barcode along with the serial number. This allows the visually impaired to determine the denomination of a banknote using a handheld device that was distributed by the Bank of Canada for free by the Canada National Institute for the Blind. Canada's 8th Prime Minister, Wilfrid Laurier, remains on the blue 1986-5. The English and French languages continue to alternate top or bottom with the Bank of Canada, left or right with the signature descriptions, and the denomination text in the lower left corner. It's also worth noting that the detailed pattern background varies in color, shape, placement, and style for each denomination. And I'll say this, it's a pretty good looking note because, well, it's blue. The reverse of the Birds of Canada 5 displays the belted kingfisher. The name belted comes from the stripe on the breast. They are considered a medium-sized bird that measures between 28 to 35 centimeters or 11 to 14 inches in length. The 5 is the only denomination to have the design bleed off left and right of the banknote. The purple $10 note wasn't released until 1989, but Canada's first and third Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, remains from the previous issue. I find it kind of funny that the Prime Ministers get their name under the date, but not the Queen. I guess everybody knows who she is. Looking at the large left denomination numeral, it's worth noting that all denominations have different interior lathe work. The $10 reverse features the dark brown and white osprey in flight, a beautiful engraving. They are easily recognized by the dark stripe extended from the beak across the eye and onto its back. A powerful bird of prey, they aren't eagles or hawks, but simply an osprey, and they measure about 24 inches in length. The yellow-green 20 is the second of 3 notes of the issue with the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. Yeah, see, no name. The Birds of Canada series was one of the first banknotes to include a reflective, color-shifting metallic patch to combat photocopier use. These were used on denominations of 20 and higher. And yes, I know for you Canadian currency numismatics, the 20 wasn't issued until 1991, but it's my video, so we're going with it. The $20 reverse displays a pair of common loons, also the state bird from my home state of Minnesota. They're known for their red eyes and eerie, haunting call. Fast fact is that you only see about 1/3 of their body when they're on the water. Loons are a pretty large bird and measure about 1 meter long or about 3 feet. The red 1988 issue of the 50 bears the image of W.L. Mackenzie King, who was the longest-serving Prime Minister of Canada, serving 3 different terms totaling over 21 years. King is most well known for serving during World War II. I have to state that the 50 is my favorite because of its color vibrance. The other Birds of Canada notes all tend to be a bit muted in color, but not the 50. The 50 reverse displays the snowy owl, appropriate for Canada. They are about 20 to 27 inches in length, with varying amounts of black-brown markings, giving the bird of prey a salt and pepper look. This type of salt and pepper, not this one, just to be clear for everyone. And yeah, by the way, I do really miss the 1975 RCMP musical ride vignette, but, you can't have everything. On the reverse of all the notes, the word Canada is not just a solid block of color, but is made up of hundreds of tiny parallel lines that occasionally change direction. A pretty cool security feature. Sir Robert Borden, the 9th Prime Minister of Canada from 1911 to 1920, best known for his leadership during World War I, is featured on the TAN 100. Microtext is used in the background of the center bar area. That's kind of cool. The denomination and the Bank of Canada in both English and French are alternately repeated. Again, a security feature. The $100 reverse features the country's namesake bird, the Canadian goose, famous for its white chinstrap marking and distinctive honk. There are actually 8 species that are basically divided into large and small classifications. The large bird weighs up to 15 pounds and also mates for life. The rose-colored 1000 note was reintroduced in this series, replacing the 1954 issue that had remained in circulation and print, but it was the last 1000 issued by the Bank of Canada. The notes were withdrawn from circulation for criminal activity reasons in 2000. Queen Elizabeth II makes her first and last appearance on the $1,000 denomination. Additional micro-printing is used in the decorative center background for all the Birds of Canada notes where the denomination is repeated over and over. Again, a little sad to see these large denomination notes go by the wayside. The reverse features a pair of pine grosbeaks, which are part of the finch family and dwarf common finches because they measure about 20 to 25 centimeters or 8 to 10 inches in length. The original choice for the 1000 reverse was the spruce goose, but controversy came about because the bird is considered weak because of its habit to remain motionless instead of fleeing. That habit earned the nickname fool hen in parts of Canada. So that's why we have grosbeaks on the 1000 reverse. For the first time, Canada integrated an ultraviolet or UV feature into the paper. The small dots or planchets that are randomly scattered into the paper glow blue under the UV light. But this would be the last time the planchets were used as a security device with or without UV. Well, that's it for the Birds of Canada 1980s banknotes issued by the Bank of Canada. Next up is Mexico.
The 1980s for Mexico was a continuation of the series that started in 1969 when Bank of Mexico began producing its own banknotes. The new series was issued from 1969 until 1991. The 5, 10, and 20 peso denominations were dropped during the 1970s because of the high inflation that continued throughout the entire decade of the 1980s. There would be an additional 8 notes that had a new denomination or a new design issued during the decade. All of the notes' multiple security features far surpassed Canadian and U.S. currency at the time. It's also worth noting that there were multiple issues of denominations with slight design and color changes that, to be honest, made it kind of confusing for a novice Mexican collector. And I'm going to only show an example of just one, or just at least one. All the banknotes issued during the 80s have been demonetized by the Bank of Mexico and only have a collector value. There are a lot of denominations to cover, so take your bathroom break now and brace yourself for some really bad Spanish pronunciation.
We'll start with the 1981 50 pesos, a denomination that was issued but put on hiatus and wouldn't be issued again until 1992 because of the high rate of inflation during the 1980s. The beautiful blue 50 pesos has the portrait of Benito Juarez, president of Mexico from 1858 to 1872, and the first indigenous or non-European person to be the head of state or any country in the post-colonial Americas. In the background is an exterior perspective of the Palacio Nacional, the home of the President of Mexico, located in Mexico City. The building dates back to 1522. The reverse depicts a Zapotec funerary urn depicting the god of maize, Coshibi. In the background is the Palace of Columns at the Zapotec ruins of Mitla, located in south-central Mexico. The 1980s 100 peso design rolled out in 1974 with the portrait of Venustiano Carranza. He was elected as the first post-revolutionary president of Mexico in 1917 until he was assassinated in 1920. To the right is the adaptation of the mural The Trench by Jose Clemente Orozco. The mural is a visual representation of the violence of the Mexican Revolution. Note the incredible level of detail of the engraving of the background and the cultural representation of an eagle in the upper right. Very cool. The reverse has the illustration of an Aztec shackmole sculpture. These figures possibly symbolize slain warriors. The background engraving detail is again stunning, as well as the eagle integrated into the background on the upper left. It's actually a registration device or a security feature that is mirrored from the front. Not all of the series notes use this. Some of the notes also have UV security threads embedded into the paper. The 500 has Francisco Madero, the 37th President of Mexico from 1911 to 1913, who was assassinated in a coup. This is the last 500 issued with the design type. The previous two actually had a watermark in the far left. No information as to why they changed this for the last issue. Again, the level of engraving is incredible. There's also a security registration device to the far right that is mirrored on the reverse. The main feature of the 500 pesos reverse is the fantastic illustration of a large Aztec calendar or sunstone. This is the same illustration used on the discontinued 1943 to 1971 peso. The background has the image of the Tizic stone carving, a giant cylindrical carving dating back to the 1400s. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is depicted on the 1984 1,000 pesos front. She was a poet, dramatist, scholar, nun, and a well-known writer of the Latin American colonial and Hispanic Baroque period, whatever those are. She achieved considerable renown in both Mexico and Spain in the latter part of the 1600s. On the left, this series has the pen and inkwell registration device. Like the 500 pesos, previous 1,000 issues used a watermark in the same space. Again, don't know why the watermark went away and the registration device came about. The 1,000 peso reverse depicts the Plaza of Santo Domingo in Mexico City, in which the Church of Santo Domingo is at center. The church was completed in 1571. The 1,000 pesos is the first banknote to have security thread embedded into the paper, and it also has UV light security threads. A security registration device is at the right. The 2,000 pesos was a new denomination for Mexico and only issued from 1983 to 1989. The 1985 front features the portrait of Justo Sierra, a prominent liberal writer, historian, journalist, poet, and political figure in the late 19th and early part of the 20th centuries. To the right is the Central Library of the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico City. To the far left is a security registration device. The reverse features the illustration of the cloister of the old university with the equestrian statue of King Charles IV of Spain in the center during the early 1800s. The statue was moved to another location in 1852. The illustration is wonderfully integrated with the surrounding contemporary lathe work. The note also has a security thread running through the paper. Another new denomination, the 5,000 was only issued from 1980 to 1989 with two color variations. This 1983 series is the more colorful of the two, and both feature the portraits of the 6 boy heroes and the national emblem of the Battalion of San Blas flag, which represents the infantry unit founded in 1823. The boy heroes were military cadets killed in defense of Mexico City during one of the last major battles of the Mexican-American War in 1847. The second version is a muted tan brown without a watermark. The highlighted portrait is Juan de la Barra, who was the chief of cadets for the academy and died alongside the boys. The reverse depicts an engraving of the castle of Chapultepec, the location of the military academy where the boys died. To the right is the coat of arms of the heroic military academy. The security features of the 5,000 pesos has colored dots or planchets that glow under UV light. The security thread is upgraded and turns blue under UV light and has microtext reading Bank of Mexico. The watermark of De La Barra is on the left. The new 10,000 pesos was issued in 3 color variations, all with basically the same design. This series 1985 has green paper and features the portrait of Lázaro Cárdenas, a general in the army and later the 51st president of Mexico in the late 1930s. Cárdenas implemented massive land reform programs and led the exploration of the country's oil industry, which is probably why an oil refinery is pictured in the lower center background. The center of the 10,000 pesos is an engraving of Coyoxawaki, the Aztec goddess of the moon. In the upper left background is a representation of the Templo Mayor in Mexico City, and finally in the lower left an Aztec sculpture representing a snail. The security thread is the same as the 5,000 pesos and turns blue under UV light, and has the microtext reading Bank of Mexico. The watermark of Cárdenas is on the right. The 20,000 pesos has the portrait of Andrés Quintana Roo, who was one of the most influential men in the Mexican War of Independence and served as a member of the Congress when he presided over the drafting of the Mexican Declaration of Independence in 1813. In the center background is the vignette of the Talam ruins, one of the last cities inhabited by the Mayans. The site dates back to 500 AD and is located on the coast of the Caribbean Sea on the Yucatan Peninsula. The reverse depicts an engraving of lintel 45 of Yaxchilan located in a building in the Mayan ruins of Chiapas, located close to the border of Guatemala in southern Mexico. The background depicts wall paintings from the Temple of Paintings. The UV security thread and planchet dots are used along with a watermark of Quintana Roo on the far right. The 50,000 pesos was issued only from 1986 to 1990 and features Cuauhtemoc with a stylized glyph representing his name. Cuauhtemoc is the last Aztec ruler in 1522 and was executed by the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés. He appeared on the 1,000 pesos from 1948 to 1977. In the center of the reverse is the engraving of the mural The Fusion of Two Cultures by Jorge González Camarena. To the right is a Mexican bracero with a stylized maguey form, which is part of the National Anthropology Museum collection. The note has a security thread and planchets, but they are not UV. The planchets have a metallic reflection. I found no information as to why the security devices are different. From 1988 to 1991, the largest denomination the Bank of Mexico issued was the 100,000 pesos. The large denominations were needed because of high inflation, which affected all three countries but was very acute in Mexico. The front features Plutarco Elias Calles, the 47th president of Mexico in the mid-1920s. Calles was the founder of the National Revolutionary Party, which would dominate Mexican politics until 1988. The background depicts the main entrance of the Bank of Mexico. To me, the 100,000 reverse appears to be a which one doesn't belong thing. It's the only reverse of this series that shows a realistic landscape and animal, which is a white-tailed deer. The imagery is from the state of Sonora, which is the home of Plutarco Elias Calles, who is also portrayed in the left watermark window. The security features change again, reverting back to the embedded UV threads along with the security thread and the metallic reflective planchets. I haven't talked about the seals, but all the reverses bear two Bank of Mexico seals that vary in size, design, and color. The round seal is of the Secretary of Finance and Public Credit, and the rectangular seal is that of the Bank of Mexico. These seals date back 100 years to the bill and beak banknote era. That's it for Mexico for the 1980s. A very impressive issue. On to the United States. Before I get into the U.S. banknotes of the 1980s, I have to correct a mistake from the 1970s Smackdown video. I didn't highlight the Series 1976 $2 Federal Reserve note. It was a brand new, first ever $2 Federal Reserve note. I did show it in the video, but didn't talk about it. The front design went almost unchanged from 1963. It just changed from a United States note to a Federal Reserve note. The reverse was very new. Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, was replaced with an adaptation of John Trumbull's Declaration of Independence painting that was completed in 1818.
The creation of this note goes back to 1963 when legislation was passed amending the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 to allow for the issuance of $1 and $2 Federal Reserve notes. The Treasury discontinued the printing of the red seal $2 legal tender in 1966 and began withdrawing them from circulation in 1968. In 1974, the idea was conceived to reintroduce the $2 bill as a Federal Reserve note. It was created for cost savings moves because they thought that people would use a 2 instead of a 1. Well, it didn't work out, really. It was not as widely assumed issued as a bicentennial commemorative. It was just simply a coincidence. Okay, on to the U.S. banknotes of the 1980s, which this decade really had no changes. Nothing, nada, zero, zilch, zippo. So once again, I will highlight the U.S. banknotes set to elevator music. No disrespect to U.S. currency, but you've only seen minor changes, and the overall design has basically remained the same for the last 60 years. You know what's on them, and you know who's on them. All right, here's the banknotes.
Well, that was what the United States issued for banknotes in the 1980s, and that wraps up the 1980s for U.S., Canadian, and Mexican currency. Canada rolled out a brand new issue, Mexico continued releasing banknotes with the updated design, and the U.S. made no changes at all. So I have to be Captain Obvious here and break the news that the U.S. is now officially out of the running and has been since the 1930s. That leaves Canada and Mexico squaring off for the Smackdown title for the 1980s.
And the winner of the USA versus Canada versus Mexico Smackdown is Mexico. Mexico takes home their second win because of the amount of detail level, color, cultural symbols, history, and design. Combine all that with numerous modern security features, and it just adds up to an amazing banknote series by the Bank of Mexico. I will give a lot of credit to the Bank of Canada and the Birds of Canada issue. Remember, this same Mexican banknote design lost in overtime shootout in the 1970s. Well, that's it for video number 45. We'll see what happens in the 1990s, where one country had big changes, one had very small changes, and one nothing at all. As always, I do appreciate your time. If you haven't already done so, please take the time to subscribe to the channel. And if you like what you see, hit the thumbs up button, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks for checking in.